February 19th, 2019. Interesting. I guess it's been a week since I've filmed, and I really need to get back on a more regular schedule because it's like exercise for the voice. Not technique, but just like writing or doing any kind of practice. When you do it more often, it's there's something that kicks in. So what have I been doing the last week? What have I been preoccupied with? Trying to figure out what I'm going to do after the class is over, which is now I realize is like I'm going to have some sessions with Charlie one-on-one, see if I can develop this more completely or more thoroughly. I'm going to turn on this light. Oh, much better. Okay. And I saw a great play in San Francisco on Saturday called King of the Yees by playwright Lauren Yee, who's done actually she's written many plays that have been produced around the world. And I think the one that I heard about a few years ago is called Cambodian Rock Band. But this one is it's very autobiographical. It's about her search to understand her father. But it's written in a very original way where she is in the play with her father, and she's very much talking about the process of trying to write this play, and then the play becomes that process, and it's just hilarious. It was like laugh out loud funny and so well done with such variety of performance modes. And all Asian cast, which is kind of fun. So there's this, like, I'm excited to be witnessing, just awakening to this sort of, for me, resurgence of this generation of Asian American stories, having grown up with a few, like Amy Tan, Maxine Hong Kingston, Gish Jen, that sort of generation, and then having a lull. I feel like there was a gap where no one of my age was writing anything till Amy Chua, who's around my age, I think, maybe a few years older, but sort of generally from the same decade. And then, and now there's just this whole community, I feel like, of voices that I keep discovering. So there's a lot of variety to draw from and to be part of. And I have to, this is just, it's happening for me at the time that it's happening for me. I was reading Gish Jen's story just now, and she's in her 60s, I believe. So full 20 years older than me. And she somehow made the break right after college from like business school to MFA and Iowa Writers Workshop. She sort of quit Stanford Business School and went to Iowa Writers Workshop in her 20s. And apparently her mother didn't speak to her for 18 months after that decision. But now her voice is sort of like, her latest books have been about this construct that she's come up with, the independent self and the interdependent self, as a way to understand China versus America. And it's like very grounded in academic theory. And I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, that's one way to frame it, but I'm like, it's less interesting to me to come up with these models and kind of pander to this need to dichotomize Eastern versus Western culture. Because I feel like what I've discovered inside me is there's not one Eastern self. I feel like with my mixed Eastern heritage of Chinese displaced and then native Taiwanese bloodlines, and I see the difference, the very, to me, stark contrast in those lineages in my particular case, and trying to sort that out because they're not just Chinese. They're not the same. There's a particular history of the Chinese who were displaced to Taiwan, which is one chapter of a big story. Then the others, the diaspora that was displaced to Hong Kong, displaced to, wherever. And I just have one little slice of that. It's just one of the 2 million people that did that. And then the whole native Taiwanese thing, which is a whole other story that, I'm trying to grasp and there's thankfully more and more translated literature from Taiwan that's very, very fascinating to me. And there's sort of nostalgia for the past as opposed to China. Has a lot of wanting to just hide it or just move on or just amputate it. And so that nuance is something that I feel like is a fresh view, because again, we're like so used to just categorizing things into East versus West, Occidental, Oriental. It's sort of an old model to me. It feels like from an era that was about trying to set up these dichotomies that are in my world, in my own experience, it's about smashing that and saying that there's a lot of specific history for micro locales and then individual families that are affected in different ways by that history that go into, the uniqueness of a person's history that is shared, but also unique. And I think that, so Gish is, from what I'm understanding of the very brief synopses I've read, she's sort of trying to place these two value systems, uniqueness versus interconnectedness, in conflict within herself. And I feel many layers of conflict in myself. One is the conflict, like sort of the mini restaging of the Civil War, where you had this small group of people from China that went to Taiwan and claimed it. And then, hello, there's native Taiwanese people there. Do we, want to talk about how they completely appropriated that for themselves and just disregarded the Taiwanese people? And then the confused identity of the Taiwanese people themselves, who've been colonized for centuries and have become very compliant with whoever comes in as the colonists, and sort of have their own way of sticking together and surviving that, and a lot of intermarriage, as well as just emphasis on family life and survival as a way to get through it, and not being able to dig their heels in to their ideals, because they would just get mowed over. So that conflict is in my personal history, in the marriage itself, and then played out at the interpersonal level. And then in both branches of that tree, very much like the way that those values played out is evident to me in the way what I see. And then the conflict with the transplanted family of all of that, the conflict that was happening between individuals with this these different lineages and branches, coming into conflict with America in the 1980s, materialism, consumerism, anti-intellectualism. All of that converging in our family and in my own life and among family members, so that we each sort of took our own unique blend of all of those conflicting values and ran with it and expressed it. And then all of those things clashed and converged. So that's really the fact that I can say that right now is like huge. I can't even say how much progress that means to me to be able to say, thank you, Gish Jen, for sharing your view, but I recognize the nuance of my own experience. And that's me developing voice and developing authorship and becoming a participant in a conversation where I can see what someone else is saying, take it in, and also say, this is how I see it, and these are maybe the differences or the subtleties. So I started out this broadcast kind of saying, checking in with myself after tonight, which was another class with Charlie, and I tried a monologue that has been sort of a central exploration in my story, and that's this character of China that I'm creating. So I brought her tonight, and something about it, even though I made up this character. She's totally imagined. She's a fictional character, but I felt like in the pit of my stomach this sense of shame when I came back home tonight. And I wanted to check in about why that was. And it does feel like a betrayal, similar to how I would feel if when I think about kind of questioning or inquiring and potentially poking holes in the idea of the American dream and the idealized promise of what America offers. I back away from that completely. I don't want to go there, or something in me is telling me, don't do that, it's dangerous or something. And the same thing about China. It's like, maybe it's a feeling that I'm cutting myself off from my own roots, but actually my attempt to write her is an attempt to recover something that I feel was so incomplete. My understanding of my roots is so incomplete because it was a caricature. It was like, take our word for it. This is an N of one. Like, I have one data point for Chinese culture. That's my parents. And that's, all I have to go on because I didn't grow up in a Chinese American community or with any encouragement to belong and join. So that's another thing that's really interesting about what Gish Jen is saying. Like, she attributes this interconnected kind of collectivist part of herself to her Chinese part of herself. And then she juxtaposes that with her ambitions as a novelist, which is a very individual voice that she has to assert in the world. For me, that because of my particular mother and the messaging that she had, having feared the communists and all of their practices of witch hunting and cracking down on people that would get together. And that really was huge in her mind. It was like this, it haunted her, right? And stayed with her, and she passed it on. She was she avoided all groups of people out of this fear messaging that came through her parents to all of those siblings. So they very much felt like islands who had to cling together, and yet they were desperate for any sense of belonging and connection to a larger world that would include them. But they kind of gripped so tightly in this trauma model of like, no, we're not going to get caught. We're not going to join anything, any groups. We don't belong to anyone except ourselves. So they're Chinese, and they brought that. America didn't give that to them. That's something they brought with them, that they actually brought across the strait from China during the communist terror. They brought it to Taiwan. They continue to live in that terror, and they brought it to America. And so to say that to me, America actually demanded of me more connection and reaching out than I was able to give from my Chinese upbringing. which said, keep to yourself. Don't tell anyone anything about what happens in your house. It's none of their business. You don't have to belong to anyone. You just take care of yourself. And that's all you have to do. There's no one else you have to worry about, just yourself. And of course, somehow magically, from that sense of total focus and, in a sense, isolation, you're supposed to like magically form relationships, have a family, a personal life, and eventually live somewhere and be part of a community. Figure that one out. But that wasn't valued. Like the sense of fitting in with a community. It's like they plop themselves down in the Midwest. They chose zip codes based on the best public schools. It wasn't about like living near their friends. And so I think back, and it's like miraculous to me that we had like maybe, even though it was half a dozen, that there were any families whatsoever who had any connection to my parents. But we had about a half dozen families within a regional area, not like our immediate neighborhood or my elementary school, but like a regional area that would feed the high school. A half dozen families where like they had some connection, like the wife had gone to the same high school as my mom back in Taiwan, and they knew each other, or they knew of each other. I mean, what are the odds of that happening in Libertyville, Illinois, which is a town of like 16,000 people, in outside of Chicago, that would happen. So the fact that for me, the experience was opposite. Like my home education from the Chinese perspective was very much like, you're an island. You don't belong to anyone. You're self-sufficient. You're self-reliant. That's like Ralph Waldo Emerson concept. But then America was actually more of a pull to belong, because I felt like the only outsider, and everyone at school who was white had a place. They had friends. They knew what was going on somehow, and they felt more connected to each other, from my perspective, than I felt to anything. So that's my experience of Chineseness and Americanness coming into collision, but it's not the typical East-West, Occidental-Oriental, collectivist, individualist dichotomy that frankly annoys me, like how scholars try to pigeonhole that. And so maybe that's exactly what I have to say on this subject, which is like, hey, this was my personal experience. The idea that there's one Chinese way of thinking, I feel like I'm unpacking that and realizing that within Asia, there are so many different subcultures and then so many different periods of history that affected people, that we can't just simplify it down, even though it makes us feel better about ourselves when we can just kind of summarize a foreignness with one word. It makes it so much easier to just label, reduce, and describe things. And I stand for nuance and subtlety rather than summarizing and shortening. So maybe that's an interesting setup for a conversation, a conflict to have in this show, which is like someone trying to summarize and label and reduce, which really gets my goat, like reductionist anything. And then someone trying to point out, hey, no, there's personal experience, and let's include and be able to hear that without trying to wedge it into these labels that we're so fond of. So maybe that's it. That's what I'm here to say tonight.